You're scrolling through a crowded subway car or walking through an airport surrounded by hundreds of strangers, and somewhere in the back of your mind sits a quiet, unquestioned assumption that every single person around you, no matter how different they look or sound or live, belongs to the same species you do. You've never had to think twice about it. But rewind the clock 200,000 years and that assumption completely falls apart. Your ancestors once shared this planet with other kinds of humans. Different species, walking upright, using tools, raising children, burying their dead. And today, every single one of them is gone. You are the only human species left standing, out of at least 9 that we know existed, and almost nobody stops to ask why. So the question is simple. If there were once multiple different species of humans living on Earth at the same time, all capable, all intelligent, all adapting to their environments, what happened to all of them, and why did only one survive? Let's start with the sheer scale of what actually existed, because most people have no idea how crowded the human family tree once was. Here's what doesn't make sense until you think about it. We tend to imagine evolution as a straight line, a single chain leading directly from ape to caveman to modern human, like rungs on a ladder. That picture is completely wrong. Paleoanthropologists studying the genus Homo have identified at least 9 distinct species that walked the Earth, including Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, and the mysterious Denisovans, whose existence was only confirmed through DNA extracted from a single finger bone found in Denisova cave in Siberia in 2010. At certain points, as recently as 50,000 years ago, multiple human species were alive on Earth simultaneously. Homo sapiens shared this planet with Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, and the small-bodied Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the Hobbit on the Indonesian island of Flores, where their remains were discovered by archaeologist Mike Morwood's team in 2003. Think about that for a second. For most of human history, being human didn't mean being alone. It meant sharing the world with other humans who weren't quite like you. So what actually happened to them? This is where the story gets genuinely complicated because there wasn't one single cause. There were several, and they hit different species in different ways at different times for different reasons. Let's start with the species most people have actually heard of, because it's also the one with the most misunderstood extinction story of all. Neanderthals get discussed more than any other extinct human species, and for decades the assumption was simple. Modern humans were smarter, and Neanderthals were slow, brutish, and outcompeted into extinction. Here's what nobody talks about, though. That story has been almost completely dismantled by modern research. Neanderthals had brains as large as ours, sometimes larger. They controlled fire, made complex tools, cared for injured group members well into old age, and, according to research published by archaeologist João Zilhão, likely created symbolic art and jewelry independently of modern humans, including perforated shells found at sites in Spain dated to around 115,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years before Homo sapiens arrived in that region. These weren't primitive creatures. They were a fully capable human species that thrived across Europe and parts of Asia for over 300,000 years. So why are they gone? Genetic research led by paleogeneticist Svante Pääbo, whose work sequencing the Neanderthal genome earned him the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022, revealed something that completely reframes their extinction. Neanderthals didn't simply vanish. They were absorbed. Pääbo's research showed that modern humans of non-African descent carry between 1% and 2% Neanderthal DNA, meaning interbreeding between our species and theirs was common enough to leave a permanent genetic fingerprint in billions of people alive today. Combine that with a Neanderthal population that was likely never very large to begin with, estimated by some researchers at fewer than 70,000 individuals total across their entire range, and you get a species that didn't lose a war. It got genetically diluted into a larger, faster-growing population until there was no distinct Neanderthal left to identify. Here's the insight that flips the whole assumption on its head. In a very real, measurable, genetic sense, Neanderthals aren't fully extinct. Pieces of them are walking around in your DNA right now, reading this sentence. Now here's where the story shifts. because not every human species disappeared the same way. Let's talk about Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbits of Flores Island, because their story reveals a completely different survival pressure. Standing roughly 3.5 feet tall with a brain about the size of a chimpanzee's, these small humans lived in isolation on Flores for possibly over 50,000 years, evolving under a biological phenomenon called island dwarfism, where limited resources on isolated islands caused large species to shrink over generations. Their remains, dated as recently as around 50,000 years ago by researchers at the site of Liangbua Cave, suggest they may have still existed when modern humans first began moving through the region. Here's what nobody tells you about this part, though. Unlike Neanderthals, there's currently no strong genetic evidence of interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Homo floresiensis. Their extinction looks less like absorption and more like elimination by environmental catastrophe, most likely a massive volcanic eruption on the island around the time they disappeared from the fossil record, combined possibly with direct competition from arriving modern humans for the island's limited resources. A population that small, confined to a single island, had almost no margin for error. One disaster was enough to erase an entire branch of the human family tree permanently. That's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Isolation, the very thing that let this species survive undisturbed for tens of thousands of years, became the exact trap that ensured they had nowhere left to run when things finally went wrong. Let's move to a species discovered so recently that most people have never even heard its name. Homo naledi was identified in 2013 inside the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa through an excavation led by paleoanthropologist Lee Berger, involving a team of researchers small enough to fit through gaps in the cave barely 18 centimeters wide. What makes Homo naledi genuinely strange is the mixture of primitive and advanced traits found in a single species. A brain roughly one-third the size of a modern human's, combined with curved fingers built for climbing, alongside legs and feet remarkably similar to yours. Even stranger, researchers found evidence suggesting deliberate placement of bodies deep within the cave system, in locations that would have required climbing through near total darkness, hinting at possible ritual behavior around death in a species with a brain far smaller than what scientists previously assumed was necessary for that kind of complex, symbolic thinking. Here's the reframing moment, and it's a big one. For decades, scientists assumed a large brain was the prerequisite for ritual, symbolism, and complex social behavior. Homo naledi challenges that assumption directly, and researchers still aren't entirely sure why this species disappeared, though its relatively small, isolated population in a single cave system suggests a similarly fragile existence to the hobbits of Flores. Small, isolated populations kept showing up again and again in this story, and that pattern is not a coincidence. It's the single clearest thread connecting almost every extinct human species we know about. Now let's talk about the species that arguably had the longest run of all, because its story adds a completely different piece to the puzzle. Homo erectus first appeared roughly 2 million years ago, and according to fossil evidence including remains found at sites like Trinil in Indonesia, may have survived in some regions until as recently as 108,000 years ago, according to research published in 2019 by a team led by geochronologist Russell Seoshan. That's a run of nearly 2 million years, dramatically longer than modern humans have existed so far. Homo erectus was the first human species confirmed to control fire, the first to leave Africa entirely, and the first to develop tools sophisticated enough to process meat efficiently, fundamentally changing what an early human diet could look like. So why, after nearly 2 million years of success, did Homo erectus eventually disappear? Here's what nobody talks about. The leading theory isn't about a single dramatic event at all. It's about a slow, grinding mismatch between a species built for one kind of world and a climate that kept changing underneath them. Research on Pleistocene climate fluctuations shows repeated, dramatic swings between glacial and interglacial periods, and populations of Homo erectus, spread thin across huge distances from Africa to Southeast Asia, appear to have simply failed to adapt fast enough in certain regions as environments shifted around them, while more adaptable, resourceful populations of later human species outcompeted them for the same shrinking resources. 2 million years of success ended not by a single catastrophe, but by a species that had finally run out of new tricks in a world that refused to stop changing. Let's zoom into the piece of this puzzle that ties every one of these stories together, because there's a common thread running underneath all of them, and it's the part that should genuinely humble you. Every extinct human species we've discussed, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, Homo erectus, shared this planet at various points with an increasingly dominant, increasingly adaptable species, us. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, emerged in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago, based on fossil evidence from sites like Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, studied by researcher Jean-Jacques Hublin, and dated in 2017. And unlike every other human species before us, Homo sapiens combined something rare into a single evolutionary package: extreme behavioral flexibility, dramatically improved long-distance social networks, sophisticated symbolic communication through language, and a willingness to migrate into radically different environments faster than almost any species in the fossil record. Here's the insight that reframes the entire mystery. Modern humans likely didn't win because we were smarter than every other human species in some simple, isolated sense. Neanderthals had comparable brain size. Homo naledi showed complex behavior with a fraction of our brain volume. What modern humans had was a specific combination of traits working together: larger, more interconnected social groups sharing information across vast distances, a capacity for abstract symbolic thought that let knowledge accumulate and spread between unrelated groups, and a level of environmental adaptability that let us survive in deserts, Arctic tundra, tropical rainforests, and high-altitude mountains, often within a few thousand years of arriving somewhere new. Every other human species specialized. They adapted brilliantly to specific environments, specific challenges, specific ways of life. And when those environments changed, or when a more flexible competitor arrived, that specialization became a liability instead of a strength. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. You are not the inevitable endpoint of human evolution. You are the survivor of what was essentially a series of separate evolutionary experiments happening in parallel across the planet, most of which failed for reasons that had almost nothing to do with intelligence and almost everything to do with population size, environmental flexibility, and sheer brutal chance. If a different volcanic eruption had happened at a different time, if a different climate shift had gone a different direction, if a different small population had found a different island to hide on, you might not be here reading this sentence at all. Someone else's descendants would be. Zoom out for a second, because there's something enormous happening underneath all of this. Every human species that ever existed faced roughly the same fundamental problems: finding food, avoiding predators, surviving climate shifts, raising children successfully to adulthood. And each species answered those problems differently, based on the specific tools evolution happened to hand them. Homo erectus answered with raw endurance and an almost 2 million year run of stability. Homo floresiensis answered with island isolation, a strategy that worked brilliantly until it didn't. Homo naledi answered with a fragile mixture of ancient and advanced traits we still don't fully understand. Neanderthals answered with raw physical strength, deep social bonds, and a brain every bit as capable as ours, only to be slowly folded into a larger, faster-spreading population until their genetic identity dissolved rather than disappeared. And Homo sapiens answered with something none of the others fully combined: connection at scale. The ability to share an idea with a stranger 1,000 miles away. The ability to remember a solution invented by someone who died before you were born. The ability to abandon a failing strategy and adopt a new one within a single generation instead of waiting for evolution to catch up over hundreds of thousands of years. Here's the part that should genuinely humble you, and it's the one that changes how you should think about every stranger on that crowded subway car. The unity you take for granted. The fact that every single human being on Earth today belongs to one species, speaks some form of language, shares roughly the same biology, is not the default state of the world. It's an anomaly. For the vast majority of the 2 million year history of the genus Homo, multiple human species existed simultaneously, sometimes overlapping for tens of thousands of years in the exact same regions. The world you live in, where human only means one thing, is genuinely, statistically unusual. That reframes the whole picture, doesn't it? What feels like the most obvious, unquestionable fact about your species, that there's only one kind of human, might be one of the strangest, most fragile outcomes in the entire 2 million-year story of our genus. Zoom out even further, and this becomes almost philosophical. We tend to think of human evolution as a triumphant, inevitable march toward us, as if every other species was simply a rough draft on the way to the final version. But the fossil and genetic evidence tells a very different story. It tells you that intelligence alone didn't guarantee survival. Neanderthals had it. It tells you that complex behavior didn't guarantee survival either. Homo naledi had it. What determined survival, again and again across 9 different species and nearly 2 million years, was a brutal, indifferent combination of population size, adaptability, and timing. And modern humans happen to combine those factors more effectively than anyone else, right at the moment it mattered most. So the next time you're standing in that crowded subway car or walking through that airport surrounded by hundreds of strangers who all belong to the exact same species you do, notice what you're actually looking at. You're not looking at the only possible outcome of human evolution. You're looking at the single surviving branch of a family tree that once had at least 9, wiped out one by one through climate shifts, volcanic disasters, isolated extinction, and slow genetic absorption, until only one branch remained standing to fill every subway car, every airport, every city on Earth. Extinction came for every other human species with a different weapon each time. Isolation for the hobbits of Flores, climate mismatch for Homo erectus, sheer population dilution for the Neanderthals, and mysteries we still haven't solved for Homo naledi. Only one species answered every single threat well enough, often enough, to still be standing today. Your ancestors didn't just outlive their environment, they outlived every other version of humanity that ever existed alongside them. You're not the only chapter in this story. You're just the only one still being written.